Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. If you're like most people, at some point in your life you may have felt overwhelmed, whether that's in your personal life or in your work life, in your work environment. At some point, everybody feels overwhelmed. Feeling overwhelmed, especially when it comes to the workplace, can be really difficult and quite counterproductive. It can cause us to become stuck or feel like we're stuck, feel like we can't really move forward and take whatever action is necessary to get beyond that state of feeling overwhelmed. When it comes to work especially, feeling overwhelmed can be the result of simply having too much work, having too much to do, or sometimes it can come from the sheer magnitude of a task or a responsibility. It can be a sort of a shock to us, to our system, at which point we may, as I mentioned, freeze and not be able to move forward and get the task or the project completed. Sometimes, as a result, you may end up doing nothing, and some may call that procrastination. And it's true that procrastination may be the result of being overwhelmed. But the good news is that there is a way out of this state of feeling overwhelmed. It's not a very difficult way. It's a relatively simple way, but it requires some time and effort on your part, as most things do. So the secret to getting out of the state of feeling overwhelmed comes down to how you view or how you approach whatever this thing is that is causing you to feel overwhelmed. So on one hand, it comes down to perception, and on the other hand, it comes down to how you want to tackle the task or the project at hand. So when we're facing a large task, a large project, the key is to break it down into more manageable pieces, into smaller chunks. And when we're dealing with a long list of smaller tasks, again, it's a matter of addressing them or handling them or tackling them one at a time, rather than trying to process the entire list of tasks of things to do. That in itself can be overwhelming, just as the magnitude of a large project can be overwhelming. So again, the idea here is to break up that which is overwhelming us into smaller pieces, smaller chunks that are much more manageable and much less intimidating, much less scary. Some of you may have heard the term chunking, and chunking is the idea here of breaking a large piece or a large project, a large task into smaller chunks, hence the term chunking. So when we break a big overwhelming task or a big list of tasks into smaller pieces, smaller chunks, it becomes much less intimidating, much less scary, which makes it no longer intimidating or overwhelming. We can then see it as much more doable and, frankly, easier to deal with. And by breaking things down into smaller pieces or chunks, We take whatever was overwhelming us from contributing to the overwhelm to being part of our success as we work towards completing a list of tasks or a large project. So essentially, we're flipping it from contributing to the feeling of being overwhelmed to contributing to our success down the road. And of course, we get to experience the satisfaction of completing those smaller pieces or completing those single tasks, making us free to celebrate those small successes along the way as we work towards completing something bigger. Being able to celebrate your success and being able to see progress in these smaller steps can be quite a motivator to keep you going. Now, it's important to remember that sometimes you can do this process all on your own, but other times you may need to get somebody else's help. Maybe that's another individual, maybe that's a group or a team of people, but whatever the right approach is, and it will vary from situation to situation, don't be afraid to explore what the best way to tackle this big overwhelming thing is. So whether it's something you can do on your own or it's something where you can use some help. But the bottom line is that it can be broken down into smaller steps, smaller pieces, so that you can get things done without feeling overwhelmed and stuck. And remember that when you decide that this is a task or a project that requires some help from others, it may be time for some collaboration where you're not the only person doing all of the work. So that's another option to consider as well. When it comes to this process of breaking down big tasks or big projects or long lists of tasks, this is not limited solely to individual employees. Managers, specifically good managers, need to be on top of this. They need to be able to know when to intervene and how to intervene on the behalf of their employees. So rather than harping on an employee who is feeling overwhelmed and stuck, rather than assuming that the employee is procrastinating or wasting time for some unknown reason, a good manager will know to investigate further and be able to get the process started if this is what the case is, where the employee is simply overwhelmed either by the amount of work or by the size or magnitude of a task or a project. So a good manager will be able to figure that out, get the process going, and keep it going. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Feeling overwhelmed sometimes is part of life, but the unfortunate thing about being in that state of feeling overwhelmed is that it can stop us in our tracks. It can lead us to freeze and do nothing. Luckily, there are things that you can do to get yourself out of that state and to get moving forward. The easiest, simplest thing to do is to change how you see whatever it is that's overwhelming you and how you approach it. And to do that, you can simply break things down into smaller pieces or smaller chunks, which will allow you to address those smaller tasks in smaller steps, one at a time, making it less intimidating, not overwhelming, and giving you the opportunity to celebrate completing these steps as you move forward, which in itself can be a great motivator. This really is that simple, but it requires some practice. And don't forget that managers have an important role to play here too. If they see an employee that is struggling or feeling overwhelmed or being stuck or seemingly is procrastinating, it's up to a good manager to investigate and then to help move things forward. As this week unfolds, I encourage you to take a look at your own workload and be honest with yourself in identifying whether or not there are areas or projects where you may feel overwhelmed, where you may feel stuck. If that is the case, if you're able to identify those things, please take what you learned in this episode today and apply it so that you too can get out of that state of feeling stuck, feeling overwhelmed, and move forward so that you can enjoy success in your efforts on a daily basis while at work. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G. There you can find the video version of the podcast. In addition to that, you can also find videos that focus on stress management. So I encourage you to check that out. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy